You're listening to the Outright Proud podcast, LBQ Parenting series. In this series, we'll hear about the parenting experiences of lesbian, bisexual, and queer activists from around the world, including Outright staff, LBQ Connect alumni, and sounding board members. This series is an opportunity to share their stories, amplify their needs, and celebrate their families. On this week's episode, Neela Ghoshal, Outright's Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research, has a thrilling conversation with Chamindra Weerawardhana about what parenting means to Chamindra as a queer woman and how she navigates conversations with her children and at their school about gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, consent education, racism, and rainbow family dynamics.
Hi, Chamindra. It's so great to have you here with us today on our podcast about LBQ Parenting.
Hi, Neela. Good to see you, and it's a great pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've been talking to a few people about this subject, and I would love first for our listeners to just know a little bit more about who you are and how you identify in terms of positionality on the queer spectrum. And maybe you can say a little bit about what that brings to your parenting. And then, of course, we'll dig in a little bit deeper on that.
Surely. So my name is Chamindra, and I'm a queer woman from Sri Lanka. And so most of the time I am based in the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, that is on the west coast of Canada in British Columbia. And I also spend a lot of time in the British Isles in the north of Ireland in Ulster, where I lived and worked for a long time. When it comes to my identity as a Sri Lankan queer woman, the word queer is very much to me the umbrella term. It encompasses, in terms of sexual orientation, being a lesbian woman. It encompasses, in terms of gender identity, being a woman of trans experience or a non-cis woman. It also encompasses certain social class dynamics, caste dynamics, for instance, being what you would say in the Indian subcontinent today, an Avarna woman. And that too is very much part of what I represent, where I come from. By training, I am a political theorist with an interest in feminist political theory and international relations, also with an interest in peace building, conflict transformation in deeply divided places. And I have also worked in human rights advocacy at local level in my home region in South Asia, and also in North America, and also in the Europe region, especially in Ireland. And at the same time, I have worked in UN advocacy and human rights advocacy at international level in the Geneva and New York UN sectors. So that's another part of my work. So these days, my primary project is a second book project called Feminism in the Age of Fascism. So it's a project that really looks at challenges to feminist advocacy, feminist thinking, and feminist ways of life in the present times that we live in. So that perspective on, to quote Dr. Sarah Ahmed, living a feminist life or feminist ethics are very closely connected to my lived experience as a parent or as a mother of two young children, aged 12 and 9. And as a queer person, as a queer woman in general, parenting, family life comes with its shared challenges, right? I say shared challenges because between a queer woman of my lived experience and a queer woman of a different set of lived experiences, there would be a lot of shared challenges when it comes to parenting and family life, because reproductive prerogatives, reproductive rights, the right to have a family or not to have a family, the right to be a parent or not to be a parent, are all in this society conceptualized along very cis heteronormative terms, right? So that creates a whole range of systemic challenges.
Yeah. So Chamindra, this is amazing. I loved hearing about all your identities and the ways that they interact with each other. And I feel like you've basically just provided us with the first chapter of your book, or maybe your next book on feminist parenting. And I was thinking, as you talked about your various identities, that in some way parenting is, of course, an identity in itself. It's also a job. It's a full-time job in itself that we all do on top of all of our other jobs. And I would love to hear, well, let me say this. I want to hear about, how you bring your queer feminist perspectives into your parenting. But before that, I would love to hear a little bit more about your kids. I think I heard one in the background. You said they're 8 and 12. I know they just got home from school. Just tell me a little bit about them.
Yeah, so Moksha, my daughter, she's 12 this year, turning 13 in the summer. And Oshin, her little brother, is 8 years old. So both of them are citizens of Germany through their other mummy. And also they share a shared Sri Lankan identity, in the sense that I am from a Sri Lankan Sinhalese background, which is the ethnic majority in Sri Lanka. And their other mom is from a Tamil background from northern Sri Lanka. So two very different languages, and also a very heavy shared history of conflict between these two communities, and antagonism of a 30-year war and everything. So the children also carry, to a certain extent, that legacy as well, right? So there's a lot of conversation around us, not only about, questions of feminism, questions of queerness, but those things are also interlinked to broader questions of, how we bring together the originalities of our, different roots to the task of parenting, in a very kind of also parenting outside that country, outside the Sri Lankan context, in a foreign land.
Yeah, I mean, two thoughts in relation to that. And one is that, Chamindra, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how it must be so hard for your children and also for you to check off any box when you're required to put yourself in any kind of box according to your identity. And also about how wonderful that is, because actually that's creating the family that you have is really queering the concept of parenting and family. And that's part of probably creating the more diverse world that we need to create. So I would love to just hear a little bit more about your parenting journey. What were some of the things that you thought about when you went into parenting, and what has surprised you as a queer parent? What have been some experiences that have surprised you?
So one of the first words that come to mind is the word choice, right? So we were both lucky, fortunate enough in a world where the word choice is denied systematically to a large percentage of women out there, right? When it comes to bodily autonomy, when it comes to reproductive rights. So both of us were lucky in the sense that we had a choice. We were in a situation when it comes to, my older child, my daughter, she was born in Germany. And the first kind of gynecological medical appointments, for example, those are places where they ask you, once a pregnancy is diagnosed, they ask you whether this is a pregnancy you want to continue or not. So it gives the birth giver and the partner a choice, right, as to whether you want to proceed. So in that sense, we have been compared to, given the challenges that we face in global health when it comes to reproductive justice, when it comes to the body of health related rights that we know as women's health in general, and also the healthcare of gender diverse people, I come from a place of privilege in that sense. But at the same time, one of the major challenges has been, we had that choice, yes, but then you enter a system that is built on extremely heteronormative, cis-heteronormative foundations. So from an early stage of this journey, it has been not short of situations where you are perceived out there as the odd one out, in terms of, antenatal care, postnatal care, creche kind of facilities, primary schools, and now senior school. So there is this perception of being perceived as the unusual presence or the other as such, right? And this has been a defining factor, but it has also been a major learning curve, a learning experience as well, because like I said earlier, this is a shared set of experiences. Whenever I would personally face certain challenges being a parent when it comes to the intersections of queerness that I represent, for example. And it also concerns the children, right? When you walk into a school setup or something for an event or anything, especially my children are in the north of Ireland, which is a socially conservative place. And you would see people coming in these very, like what you see are very cis heteronormative family compositions. And then comes this family with the two mummies, right? And also two brown women. And in a context that is only, since the Good Friday Agreement, it's been 25 years, but it's a society that's only opening up to the world at a slow pace. It's only starting to happen in the last 10 years or so it's not a lot of time. So in a socially conservative society that's been closed up with its own conflicts, with its own internal security and other sectarian challenges, there comes two brown women with two young brown children to a school setup. So you can see the multiple intersections at which it kind of rattles people's perceptions and how people perceive us, for example, So those are some of the everyday realities of this. And then you go into some more challenging realities when it comes to, for example, how we create a space of comfort for our children. For example, for a child who comes from a household with any form of queerness, I do believe that every household should have space for queerness and for non-heteronormativity, non-cis-normativity, because every child deserves that opportunity, that space to question, their gender identity, to ask questions, to discover their sexuality in a safe context, safe and caring environment. And in that context, how do you, because you're sending your child to a school, you're sending your child to a very cis heteronormative context, in some cases quite an ableist context, and in some cases where certain racial fault lines would be unmistakable. So in that context, how do you work with your child and the other caregivers involved, teaching staff involved? How do you create structure, or how do you create a support network for your child? So that is a much more serious challenge, which we're both taking, at a slow pace, one step at a time, having conversations, and sometimes fruitful, sometimes, one step forward, two steps back. But it is something that we need to keep focused on. Those are some of the key challenges.
Yeah. How do you have those conversations? What are some of the conversations that you've had to have with the school, for instance? And how does that affect you as a parent? I'm curious whether you go into these conversations with the kind of activist approach that I know you take to other parts of life, right? Where you say, I'm here, I'm ready to make change. Or is it something that's just exhausting because you want this to be just a day-to-day part of life where you're just recognized and accepted without having to fight for it?
Well, Neela, I think it's a mixture of those priorities, because, for example, last year when my daughter started her senior school, there was an information day over the summertime. When we went there were, these stalls where we could meet different teachers, teaching, different subjects, and stalls providing information about the clubs and societies, extracurricular activities in the school, and so on. And there was this one place where we went to and sat down. It was about, rights education, religious education, and so on. And this lady happened to be also someone in the school management hierarchy. So I asked her a question. I asked her, what is your equality and diversity policy? Basic language, right? DEI language. Do you have an equality and diversity policy? Do you have an inclusive policy when it comes to children of different lived realities and so on? And then the immediate answer we got was, she looked at both of us and must have clocked us in a certain way. Her response was, something we still laugh about. She was like, oh, we are very inclusive about different religious traditions from different parts of the world. So we will respect your religion. when it comes to how we, look after your children, or if your child wants to wear a headscarf or something, we will consider that favorably, and so on. So then we were both taken aback, and then I had to ask this question: do you have a policy when it comes to LGBT children, for example? And then you could see, 2 steps back, kind of, cautious attitude from this lady. But then she was like, yes, we do, because the education authority has a policy and we are bound by law to implement that policy. And then the next question was, if in case we were to, and there were a need to have a conversation, who is the point of contact? How can we start a discussion? What are the policies? What are the procedures we need to follow, and so on? And trying to get at some concrete information on how best we can proceed, right? So I would say that's the kind of approach, that's the best kind of approach in these situations, because when you ask questions of that nature, you'll come across 2 things. You'll come across either the existence of a policy, which may or may not be fully implemented, but the existence of a policy, I think, is important in these contexts. And the second thing you'll come across is the fact that, the more unfortunate circumstance where there is no policy, there is no consistency, which can lead to a sense of insecurity for a queer parent and for a child, So in this situation, my approach would be to take things incrementally. And if we were to notice that there is a lack of understanding, like let's say when it comes to my own children, my older child especially, we haven't noticed any verbal expression of that nature as yet. But if there were to be a concern in relation to, let's say, a non-binary identity, for example, in the years to come, we're going to need to have a conversation with the school, right? So how do you work with a child who is gender non-conforming? How do you work with a child who is non-binary? It's not only us as a queer parent. As a queer parent, you're better placed to kind of strike that conversation, have that conversation, and maybe explore ways in which you can support the school authorities to develop a policy. So keeping the channel for conversation open, I think, is very important. So given the developments that are taking place throughout the world, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in other parts of the world, in North America and elsewhere, in France as well as of late, some of these conversations may be challenging. We all know about the Cass report. We all know about so many anti-gender identity related laws being passed at US state level and so on. So some of these conversations can be challenging. So if there is a red line, if there is a difficulty of moving forward, so that is when there is a need to take a different approach, where you need to find a larger support network in terms of rights around, rights as in specialists in human rights issues, maybe seek the relevant legal advice that is needed, and then maybe focus on creating a collective or a movement and so on. That's another level of advocacy, and my hope and prayer to queer parents is that nobody would be forced to face that kind of challenge, because it's a lot of work, and it is obviously, if you put your heart and mind to it, you would get somewhere indeed. But we have seen in some of the high-profile cases in so many countries that it's also very exhausting, right, for parents and for children, because you're basically fighting for basic rights, basic everyday rights. So when you have to go such an extra mile for basic everyday rights, it can be extremely draining and extremely exhausting. So what we can hope for is that we come to a place where we could, have conversations and address these issues without having to face that much strain.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some fights that you don't want to fight, especially since every day just getting your kids to put their clothes in the laundry is a big enough fight as is, right?
100%.
And Chamindra, you mentioned the Cass report, and just for our listeners, this is a report from the UK that essentially casts doubt on the availability of gender-affirming healthcare for children, which I know that people who have trans and non-binary children right now are really worried about in terms of what it means for the healthcare that might be available for their children. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the conversations that you have with your children themselves, because you mentioned that part of queer parenting is making sure your children are equipped to handle these situations if they come up in school or elsewhere, but either in terms of preparing them for challenging situations they might happen, or even just in terms of kind of the funny everyday conversations we have with our children about our identities and our families. What are some things that have come up with your kids?
So in our case, it has been a learning curve, right? In age-appropriate language, we've tried to talk to the children about queerness, about gender identity, about sexual orientation, about diversity, about difference to begin with, because in the context in which they live, they represent a lot of difference as opposed to the so-called, mainstream society as such out there. So that conversation has always been an ongoing conversation. And secondly, when it comes to having conversations with the children about queerness, it is important to take stock of the fact that this is a serious set of issues that we're talking about. It's important to have these conversations with your children, but at the same time, it is also important to never lose sight of the fact that you're talking to a child, a young child. So taking a somewhat lighthearted approach, using language and an approach that is more intelligible, digestible to the child is extremely important. For example, when my daughter was in the last year of her primary school, she came home and said to us, look, we had a conversation today in the school about periods. So there's some external person who came to talk about periods. So they separated the girls and the boys, and this conversation was only for the girls. And she said that. I said, okay, great. We had a conversation about periods. And how was the conversation? The usual. That was the answer. So then I asked, so in this conversation, did they talk about this term called bodily autonomy? No, what's that? And then did they talk about PCOS? No. Did they talk about endometriosis? No. Did they talk about pain, managing pain, period pain? No, they said okay, if it can cause a bit of pain, and if you have pain, use a hot water bottle. That's about it. That kind of thing. Not consist. I could see that the conversation on pain management hasn't been consistent. And did they talk about consent? No. All right. So then what we did was two things. One is to equip the child, find ways of equipping the child with that knowledge base, right? So finding the right kind of age-appropriate material on these issues, and kind of a queer informed approach to menstrual justice, and also once again keeping it age-appropriate. Finding that material, making that material available, accessible to the child. And the second thing I did was so thanks to COVID, there is the app, right? An app through which you can communicate with the school, with the class teacher. So messaged the class teacher on the app, it's called Seesaw, and said, look, so we heard from Moksha that, there was this conversation about periods. May I know who was the external guest you invited to have this conversation? So we were told who that guest was, and we looked up the background of that guest. So apparently that's an organization that goes to a lot of schools and talks about menstrual justice and so on. But they're connected to some kind of religious persuasion, Christian religious denominational persuasion. So the emphasis is somewhere else. It's not in a place of bodily autonomy. It's not in a place of a feminist approach to menstrual justice. It's in another place. It's in a place of abstinence, in a place of warning a child about the period. It's not in a place of supporting a child to manage the menstrual cycle in a caring, nurturing way. It's not in a place of supporting a child of a non-cis child, right? A non-binary child or a trans-masculine child would not even be considered as a child who requires a special kind of specific, more kind of tailor-made, bespoke kind of support. So there's a lot of inconsistency there. There's a lot of inconsistency, and we approached the school administration on this issue, had a conversation, and the school principal was, understanding. However, there are certain limitations, right? Certain limitations based on budgeting, funding, practicalities, other factors, and also competing ideologies as well. So in some cases, you try to have a conversation internally at home, and when you see inconsistencies, you try to fill in those gaps. That's one strategy that we would use. And in terms of our relationship with educational institutions, we try to have a conversation, try to see what difference we can make, and to the best extent we can support in making a difference, we do. But beyond that, there is a certain limit to which we can be vectors of that difference, right? So at home, I guess the main part is the main component of this is to listen to the child and ask questions, engage, have a conversation and see where the gaps are. And so in our house, because there's been a conversation about diverse gender identities and so on, again, in primary school, my daughter had a friend who was a non-binary child, and my child had a lot of understanding and on those realities, and was able to build a nice friendship, lasting friendship with that child, and be part of that non-binary kids support network, right? So all of that is part of how you share information, how you share knowledge, and it needs to be done with a lot of care, with a lot of love, with a lot of understanding, and with a lot of patience, because sometimes, as a queer parent, we might feel under a lot of pressure, to say the right things, impart the right knowledge, and so on. And sometimes it may or may not be 100% productive. So it's important to be patient in doing this work as well.
Absolutely. But I think what you also just said really demonstrates the way in which we as queer parents also have a gift to give to the world, which is our unique and open perspectives that we bring to parenting, which allows our children to open up those spaces for their classmates, and which allows schools to open up spaces for other children as well. So I think, regardless of whether you throw yourself into it as on an activist mission, or you just give your child values that allow them to make space for that other student who's seen as different, you're offering a lot to the world. And I think that's always important to keep in mind. Chamindra, just before we close, is there anything else you wanted to share? Any particular story around parenting or any wisdom that you've gleaned along the way on your journey that we didn't have a chance to talk about yet?
Well, one thing is that one thing that I would encourage, my younger friends, younger colleagues who are considering, creating families or becoming a parent, is the importance of taking stock of the challenges that parenting involves, right? As a queer person, existence as a queer person is challenging enough in the cis-heteronormative world we live in, as Dr. Bell Hooks used to call it, the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, cis-heteropatriarchy that we live in. So it's a tough call being a queer person in this society, and it's a tougher call to be at certain marginal intersections, right? Based on certain racial fault lines, gender identity-related fault lines, indigeneity-related fault lines, and so on. And so taking stock of the challenges involving parenting, I think it's very important. And then coming from a place of understanding, coming from a place of, a clear understanding of the challenges that some of the main challenges that parenting as a queer person you're likely to confront when parenting as a queer person is very important. And I would say to my friends and colleagues sometimes, you got to come from a place of that understanding, but do not let these constraints put you off. Do not be put off by these constraints. It is possible. It is difficult, but possible. A queer life, as in living a feminist life, living we're living a feminist, queer parenting life. Creating that feminist and queer feminist family space is a possibility. But it comes with its fair share of challenges, yes. But to say that it is possible, to know that it is possible, I think it's very important.
To know that it's possible, and then to come back to the first point that you made, which is that to keep working to ensure that we all have the choice, right? To make whatever decision we want about our family.
Exactly, 100%.
Thank you so much, Chamindra. It has really been a pleasure to speak to you today. I have learned a lot, and I know that our listeners have as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Neela. It's been a great pleasure.